The alert was routine, but the message was serious. A Soviet Tu-95 was heading toward Britain's airspace. Within minutes, RAF Lightnings were airborne, climbing hard to meet the threat before it ever reached the coast. This was not a chase. It was a controlled intercept, executed exactly as Britain had planned for years. The Soviet bomber brought reach and noise. The RAF brought speed, altitude, and certainty. High above the North Sea, Britain's fighters arrived first and stayed in command of the encounter. In the Cold War skies, the difference was simple. The Tu-95 could approach. The RAF decided what happened next. The Cold War rarely announced itself with sirens or speeches. More often, it began with a line on a radar screen. For Britain, that line frequently came from the north. Soviet Tu-95 Bear bombers, flying long-range patrols from bases deep inside the USSR, would approach the edges of UK-controlled airspace over the North Sea. Their routes were legal. Their intent was ambiguous. Their presence was anything but accidental. Each flight was designed to test how quickly Britain could see, decide, and respond. The Royal Air Force treated those approaches as serious business. From the moment radar operators confirmed a bear's track, the response followed a well-rehearsed sequence. Command centers evaluated speed, altitude, and heading. The goal was not to guess intentions, but to remove uncertainty. If the aircraft continued toward Britain's airspace, interceptors would launch. No debate, no delay. That interceptor was the English Electric Lightning. Built specifically for the defense of British skies, the Lightning was less a fighter and more a reaction weapon. Its defining advantage was speed to altitude. While the Tu-95 relied on endurance and range, the Lightning relied on immediacy. Crews could be airborne within minutes, climbing at a rate that few aircraft in the world could match. This was where Britain quietly held the advantage. The Soviet bomber might appear first on radar, but it was the RAF that controlled the timeline. Lightnings were vectored to intercept points calculated to place them above and ahead of the incoming aircraft. By the time the Bear's crew could visually confirm they were being watched, Britain's fighters were already in position. The intercept itself was deliberate and disciplined. RAF pilots closed to visual range, confirmed markings, photographed the aircraft and held station. Weapons remained cold. Radio silence was common. The message was conveyed through presence alone. The bomber had been detected, identified, and matched. There was no need for theatrics. For Britain, these encounters were less about confrontation and more about assurance. Each successful intercept reinforced a simple truth, that UK airspace was not porous, not neglected, and not dependent on allies to defend it in the first moments of a crisis. The system worked because it was designed to work under pressure. To the public, these events were largely invisible. To those involved, they were proof of readiness. Every Bear intercepted without incident strengthened confidence in Britain's air defence network. Radar coverage, command coordination, and interceptor performance were tested against a real adversary, not a simulation. And each time the outcome was the same. The Soviet aircraft approached, the RAF responded, and Britain retained control of the encounter. In the Cold War, that control mattered more than headlines. On paper, the Tu-95 Bear looked imposing. It was large, long-ranged, and capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Its mission was endurance, to stay aloft for hours, sometimes days, and project Soviet presence far from home. But endurance alone did not decide encounters over the North Sea. That was where the RAF Lightning changed the balance. The Lightning was designed around one ruthless priority: reach the threat before it reached Britain. Its twin engines gave it an exceptional climb rate, allowing it to go from runway to high altitude in minutes. While the Tu-95 relied on steady progress, the Lightning relied on speed, angle, and timing. It did not chase bombers from behind, it intercepted them from above. This mattered more than raw speed. By arriving high and ahead of the Bear, RAF pilots controlled the geometry of the encounter. They could observe without being observed, descend into position, and remain there as long as fuel allowed. The The Soviet crew, by contrast, knew they had been detected the moment the lightnings appeared. Any illusion of anonymity disappeared instantly. Technologically, the advantage was just as clear. Britain's integrated air defense system, radar stations, command centers, and interceptor squadrons worked as a single organism. Information flowed quickly from detection to decision to action. The lightning was not operating alone. It was the visible edge of a much larger system. This is where Britain consistently outperformed expectations. The Tu-95's noise, often joked about, was no accident. Its turboprop engines were loud by design, a psychological and acoustic signal of presence. But that same noise made it easier to track. The bear announced itself long before it arrived. The RAF used that predictability to its advantage, calculating intercept points with confidence. For the Soviet crews, the encounter was instructive. They were allowed to fly their patrols, but not unchallenged. Britain did not block their path aggressively, nor did it ignore them. Instead, it demonstrated constant awareness. Every approach was met. Every patrol was seen. The lightning did not need to fire a weapon to win the exchange. Its success was measured in minutes saved, altitude gained, and certainty achieved. By the time a Tu-95 turned away, its mission had already been answered. Britain had proven that no approach went unnoticed, and no bomber reached the edge of British airspace without being met by an aircraft designed specifically to stop it. In Cold War terms, that was victory. Not dramatic, not public, but decisive all the same. The encounters between RAF Lightnings and Soviet Tu-95s were never meant to end in confrontation. Their real value lay in what they communicated, quietly, consistently, and without miscalculation. For the Soviet Union, each patrol was a way to measure Britain's readiness. How fast did the fighters launch? From which bases? At what altitude did they arrive? Did procedures change over time? The Tu-95's mission was not just to fly, but to observe. Every intercept was logged, studied, and compared against previous encounters. Britain understood this perfectly and turned the test to its advantage. By responding the same way every time, the RAF denied the Soviets useful variation. Lightnings launched quickly. Intercepts occurred at predictable distances. The procedures were professional, disciplined, and deliberately boring. That consistency was not weakness, it was deterrence. It told the other side that Britain's air defense system was not improvising. It was waiting. These intercepts also carried political weight. Britain was not relying on allies to defend its immediate airspace. The RAF handled the first response itself, proving that the UK retained sovereign control of its skies. NATO support existed in the background, but the initial message was unmistakably British. For pilots on both sides, the encounters were tense but restrained. They flew close enough to identify markings, sometimes close enough to exchange gestures. Cameras were used more often than radios. The rules were clear: no aggressive maneuvering, no locking of weapons, no unnecessary risks. Professionalism mattered, because a mistake at altitude could escalate far beyond the intentions of either government. Over time, the pattern became part of Cold War routine. Bears approached. Lightnings intercepted. Both sides turned away with their objectives met. No headlines were required. The balance was maintained not through threats, but through repetition. For Britain, the lesson was reassuring. The system worked under real pressure against a real adversary. Radar, command, and aircraft combined into a credible shield. Each successful intercept reinforced confidence that, if the Cold War ever turned hot, the first line of defense would respond exactly as designed. That was the deeper meaning of these encounters. They were not about individual aircraft or pilots. They were about control, discipline, and trust in a system built to function when it mattered most. In the Cold War skies, Britain did not seek to provoke. It simply made one thing clear: approach would always be answered. What ultimately gave Britain the advantage in these encounters wasn't just the Lightning's performance, it was how well everything around it was organized. The RAF's strength lay in integration. Radar stations, sector control rooms and interceptor squadrons operated as a single REAT system. Decisions were decentralized enough to be fast, but structured enough to avoid confusion. By the time a Lightning pilot was airborne, most of the thinking had already been done on the ground. The intercept was an execution, not an improvisation. This mattered because time was the decisive factor. The Tu-95 could stay airborne for extraordinary lengths, but it could not rush its mission. Its speed and altitude were limited by design. Britain exploited that limitation. Lightnings were launched early, climbed aggressively, and positioned themselves to control the encounter long before the Soviet bomber reached any meaningful threshold. In effect, Britain forced the Tu-95 to operate on British terms. There was also a psychological dimension. Soviet crews knew the pattern. They knew that once they appeared on radar, interception was inevitable. That predictability removed any leverage they might have gained from surprise or ambiguity. The RAF didn't guess. It didn't wait. It responded. Crucially, Britain avoided escalation without appearing passive. The Lightnings flew close enough to be unmistakable, but never aggressively enough to provoke. This balance was difficult to maintain and required disciplined pilots and clear rules of engagement. Britain succeeded because it treated each intercept as a professional duty, not a contest of bravado. Over time, that professionalism accumulated weight. The Tu-95 patrols continued, but they did not become more intrusive. Routes remained cautious, distances were respected. The Soviets learned where Britain's lines were and saw no benefit in crossing them. Deterrence worked not because Britain threatened retaliation, but because it removed uncertainty. In Cold War strategy, uncertainty was dangerous. Britain understood that stability came from clarity.